Our lives are remembered by the gifts we leave our parents. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Bucket Think Tank for Disney Royalty Interlude, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Milo, and Kida. So, coming up to this post-Disney Renaissance era, this is sort of the reason why there wasn't a video last month, or any videos last month pertaining to the Disney Royalty line. It's not that we stopped, but I had to spend a lot of time really wrapping my head around whether or not we should be talking about the next few films we'll be talking about. Because I'm sure most of you are aware, especially if you're Disney heads, Disney nerds like me, that we won't really have a Disney princess for a good while with these films, let alone a Disney prince. So I was really trying to wrap my head around what would and wouldn't be a Disney interlude. Otherwise, even going by the narrow restrictions of Disney for a Disney princess, I could potentially be covering a lot of other films. And so we had to wonder, like, why aren't we covering The Emperor's New Groove? And I thought, well, The Emperor's New Groove doesn't quite hit the beats that I want a Disney prince to hit, primarily because The Emperor's New Groove is played up so much as a comedy, and it sort of leaves some sort of weird gaps in how Cusco functions as emperor. That he's an emperor. But that was besides the point. So let's focus on Atlantis, The Lost Empire. So this movie is sort of like a lost child when it comes to the Disney lineup. It doesn't feel like a Disney film. It doesn't even look like one. It doesn't even hit the standard rhythms and beats of a Disney film. Even its music, it's all very different from any Disney film that definitely came before it in my mind, especially for an animated one. And I would argue that it was sort of a natural progression that was going to happen if you look at how the Disney films were presented before. So leading up to this, and I want to say it was definitely The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as well as some other works by Disney Toon Studios, like The Rescuers Down Under, and even the Goofy movie. To an extent, we were seeing a definite change into how Disney films were being presented. The more popular Disney films have always focused on dreams, and we've seen a lot in our first wave of the Disney princess lineup. Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora, each of them had dreams that were sort of what they needed to get through the day, and they were hoping they'd come true. And then we went to the Renaissance era, where the dreams were something that our characters were actively chasing, or became a bit more abstract. But with Hunchback of Notre Dame, and especially Mulan, which is the one we'll probably use over Hunchback, the dream became more and more vague. It became less of a thing, and it became more that our characters had actual issues to resolve. And it didn't just start with Hunchback of Notre Dame. You could argue it started with Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, and these were just small ideas, but with Hunchback it became an actual thing. Especially with Mulan, who sort of personified how that was supposed to work. The idea is that we don't really need a vague dream. What they need is an actual obstacle to overcome, some personal issues that help us understand the characters. The journey is more important than the destination, effectively. It's not anything new, but the problem is Disney had already set itself up to be this thing. And here comes Atlantis, Lost Empire, Tarzan to an extent, and these films don't feel like what the past couple of decades have been setting up. I think that's something that hurt Atlantis more than anything else. That's why Pixar is able to be what it is, because it knows it isn't Disney in the same vein as more mainstream Disney films. And that's sort of what led to the sort of decline in films. They weren't really able to find a way to sort of balance the best of both worlds. How do we sort of move away from classic Disney, but still holding true to the core beliefs? And I think Atlantis doesn't quite know how to do that. But ultimately, I think what made this movie fail, well, it just underperformed. And movie companies, and especially those like Disney and Warner Brothers, they want to see a specific amount of return on what they've done before they decide to go forward. And Atlantis didn't meet that. I think if I was looking at this critically, the problem is, as good as this movie is, it looks great, it sounds great, the characters are great, there isn't much going on other than the story. It's very straightforward. Like, had this been made before the Disney Renaissance, it probably would have been colossally amazing. But it wasn't. And the problem is that everything that I think people like about this movie sort of stops once we get to Atlantis. Like, the really important thing about Atlantis for me was not Atlantis. It was the Audrey. It was Milo interacting with all those other characters. Sweet, Mole, Vinny. Those were really where the movie was going, in that direction. Did there have to be anything in Atlantis? Could it have just been this archaeological expedition to find the lost city and the power source, and then they find out that no one's there. Yeah, we'd have lost Kida, but I think the story would have been more served had it always kept the focus on Milo's interactions with the crew, or at least from a movie standpoint, I think that would have been a bit more unique. But that's not to say that the Atlantis part isn't good. Far from it. It thematically, this movie sets up very well. That's why I chose an opening quote, because the gifts we leave our children is sort of littered throughout the film, whether it's the disappearance of Kida's mother and the actions of her father, whether it's Mr. Whitmore and Thaddeus Thatch and the gifts they're giving to Milo, or even Rourke, who in a lot of ways sort of comes off as an alternate paternal figure. That also plays off. Even Sweets, who does the same thing. That's sort of what is the strength of this movie, is that it really is about these parental figures guiding Milo and Kida in one form or another to making a decision, to deciding who they want to be at the end of it all. That's sort of all there is to it. There isn't really a lot to deconstruct with this movie. Another problem I think would have been had would be how easy it is for Milo to change the crew's mind. I think that should have been built up a bit more, and I think, again, more focus on those relationships would have helped, I think, a bit more. But let's just focus on our characters here. So let's start off with Kida. Kida, I think the most popular one out of this film. A lot of people are still in arms a bit why she isn't a Disney princess. And again, the box office performance does determine really what makes a Disney princess. At the same time, though, because this isn't a conventional Disney movie, I don't think she would have probably made it either way. She's in her own little category. But Kida, at the time she came out, was radically different from any princess we'd seen before. In a way similar to Mulan, but she also had a bit in common with Megara. But not the way most people think. I would say ultimately, Kida draws from Princess Jasmine. Again, I think a lot of them actually draw from Princess Jasmine the further we go down. Primarily because Kida is in a sort of leadership role, and as we said before, Jasmine was the first Disney princess to actually, consider what her responsibilities would be as a ruler. And Kida sees that the people of Atlantis, they aren't really thriving. They're just holding on. They're just like, hey, we live our lives, and that's sort of it. They're stuck in a rather primitive, yet actually just a rather primitive standpoint. They have these crystals that allow them to do certain things, but they don't know exactly what the crystals are for. That's what Milo's there for. And he's able to sort of awaken Atlantis to its lost culture. At the same time, though, there is a lot of wisdom and compassion that Kida brings to the role. She's very strong-willed. I think she's a lot more sensitive than people give her credit, people want to admit. And it's not that she's sensitive in a bad way. There are things she cares about, and the people she opens herself up to, I think, is important. She sort of also echoes a bit to Ariel. Once she sees Milo, she has all these questions and about exactly how things work on the surface and everything. She wants to totally immerse herself in the next new thing. And it's played off as very endearing here. And she also has a great sense of humor about herself, or at least when it comes to Milo. She knows Milo is a scholar because, look at you. There's nothing else you can do. No. You're not good for anything else. And she means that in the nicest way possible because she does value his intelligence. Her relationship with Milo ends up being romantic. I think that might be a weak point. It's not to say that Disney has always been great at, showing an actual real relationship, though they got better when the Renaissance came in with Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast, and to an extent even Mulan. Going up to the sequel, which we don't really need to talk about that much because it doesn't really further anything, we do see that Kida is focused on, what to do with Atlantis. Should she bring Atlantis to the surface? Should Atlantis, enter the world stage? And that's always been a question with Atlantis when Atlantis exists. And currently it's going on with Aquaman in his own comics, which at some point I am going to talk about. And so that adventure, it's not just looking at Atlantean artifacts, but sort of to answer the question Kida has about what to do about Atlantis. And luckily, unlike Aquaman, she's able to just do it because, there's never any real question. And maybe that should have been the sequel, ultimately, that it should have been Kida trying to convince the Atlantean people that it's time to come to the surface. And we could have met with, different groups who say, well, why should we just show up? Or what should we do when we show up? Should we invade? Should we just enter the international community? Whatever. Or should we just not let him win? Should we build a wall? Coming up to Milo, Milo is interesting. I think, if anything, it's because Michael J. Fox just sort of merged into this role in a way that I didn't think he really could. We've never seen him do animated work, like, at all, I think. Oh no, he was in, well, if you count Stuart Little, which he was also really good in. There's something fun about Michael J. Fox's voice. It's just, there's a certain innocence to it, and a certain energy that I think only he can bring. But what I like about Milo is he's very optimistic, and he's so out of place compared to what we would consider Disney Prince. Even if you go to the other interludes, Quasimodo, uh, Arthur, Taran, those were all relatively physical people. They weren't all dashing and debonair, to be fair, but they were also very physical. They were more hands-on. Milo is an intellectual, and I was really hoping we would see more characters like him in later Disney films. He he loves his grandfather in the same way that Kida loves her father, and the lessons that they've imparted on them are really what motivates and drives them. With Milo, he wants to find Atlantis because not just because it mattered, not just because it would be the greatest archaeological find ever, but because it was what his grandfather believed existed. It was like, my grandfather says it's out there. I've done the work. It's out there, and he really wants to prove to everyone that his grandfather's not a crackpot. And he sort of that's sort of what his journey is. Sort of, in a lot of ways, breaking away from his grandfather. In a lot of ways, sort of becoming his own person. And over the course of the adventure, that's sort of what happens. He sort of spent a lot of time in his one element. And like Mulan, breaking out of that element sort of helps him become a stronger character at the end of it. We see that I don't think Milo before would have ever stood up to Rourke because he couldn't even stand up to the museum board. He couldn't. No one believed him when he said anything. Like when he sort of, threatened to resign, they just called his bluff. Like, no, you're not. You're not gonna sit down, shut up, and go back to the boiler. Here, he's not going to take that. He's found a cause worth fighting for. He's found people that are interested in what he has to say. People interested in him. That was the beauty of his interactions with the crew. Not just Sweet, not just Audrey, but Mole, Billy, all of them. Honestly, the strength of those characters is where I think Atlantis is best served. At the same time, though, it never feels quite like he learns anything from his interaction with the crew in the same way that I think. Like, Sweet seems to be the one that actually has a profound impact on him, but he has an impact on everyone else. And I think this is sort of the problem that was happening with the Page Master, if you remember that movie, where because Richard Tyler doesn't feel like he was taught anything by the literary figures. At some point they just scare him, but then they talk about, what he's learned, like, or, what he's done, like, you prevailed over evil. You looked Moby Dick in the eye, you got the makings of a pirate in you. I'm like, well, okay, but it seems like these things were always there, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Milo just needed this to show himself that he had what it took to, be what was necessary. And again, at the end of the movie, he just sort of decides to stay in Atlantis because that's where he's needed, where he can do the most good. And that's great because, again, he found, like Hercules, where he belongs, or where he feels most at home. And it's with Kida. It's with with these people who, need someone, an expert in gibberish. Ultimately, Milo and Kida sort of represent the unlimited potential of a Disney movie when you choose to break away from the mold, but at the same time, sort of the reason why we should go so far, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because I think we would have been served had we gone with those extra miles to sort of say, well, let's sort of make the music a bit more memorable. Let's sort of, put more emphasis on these characters, give them something else to do. Or honestly, more into Atlantis. Like, we saw Atlantis, but we didn't see Atlantis. If you get, like, it never feels like a person, never feels like an actual city we're seeing, so much as we're just seeing, we call this place Atlantis. But with that in mind, we're going to bring this video to a close here. If you have any thoughts on the movie, feel free to leave those down as well as any thoughts on Milo and Kida. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Feel free to check out some of my other videos here on the Disney Royalty lineup, as well as some of my other stuff. And I will catch you all later. This is the Bucket Think Tank signing off. May your fandom serve you well.